Hi, Carlos. Thanks for joining me today. We're very honored to have you as our special guest in our DX Stories series,
Mm.
which Access Partnership, the leading policy firm for the tech sector, in partnership with the StateUp, launched today with our conversation. Let me just, Carlos, before starting with the questions, please explain why are we doing this, right? In the last year and a half, digital transformation has been at the forefront of many governments' priorities and agendas.
Mm.
I would say worldwide. And I think the pandemic have showed as well that the question around digital transformation is not if, but how and when. And to some extent, it's a commonplace now talking about digital transformation. Listen this term in different forums, in different sectors, but that doesn't mean that leading these initiatives and implementing these initiatives within the public sector specifically, which I think is mostly the topic of our conversation today, is easy. Quite the contrary, I would say. So, our goal with this series of conversations that, as I said, we're beginning today, is a simple but I think important one. We want to provide a platform for people like yourself, people who are leading digital transformation processes, to improve and transform governments, to share their stories with other leaders, other governments, other public agencies, private companies, citizens, so we can learn from your experience
Mm.
and act upon recommendations to overcome the challenges that we will also discuss today. In terms of the dynamic, we want this to be as conversational as possible. We want to withdraw a little bit for the formality and rigidity of a webinar, perhaps. So, the idea is to have a conversation in a relaxed fashion and that our audience can benefit from this conversation in this format that we're proposing. Now, Carlos, throughout your career, you have helped governments realizing the potential of data and technology to improve the delivery of public services. Today, and I think since 2018, you are Director of Governance Practice on Digital Innovation in Government of the Development Bank of Latin America, what we know as CAF. You are also a member of the advisory group of anti-corruption of the World Economic Forum, and you are a member of the advisory committee on public governance of the United Nations. I can keep going. Let me stop there. We're honored to have you on our opening session.
Mm.
For our audience, Carlos, and just to kick off this conversation, tell us about your work at CAF, current projects, plans, and so on.
Before we start, thank you so much, Christopher, for the invitation and this opportunity to share some of reflections and some of thoughts with the audience from the Development Bank of Latin America, CAF. We're quite delighted to share our thoughts in this space, especially because we've been doing this work for not a long time. But let me, before we start though, just like tell you a little bit more about myself and where I'm coming from in this space, because
Please do.
I'm not a technologist. I don't know. I'm one of those that is struggling with
In full
technology. Or
disclosure, me neither, huh? Me neither, absolutely.
where I'm coming from and where a lot of our work and team is coming from is really more about the transformation bit than the digital bit. Digital transformation for us is more about transforming governments to deliver better services and to improve lives for people and for companies also, especially in developing countries and emerging economies. That's where I spent the last 20 years working. I've been working most of my career on public sector reform, state reform, anti-corruption, all these modernizations, efforts by governments around the world that are trying to better at delivering services to citizens. And I think what is happening in the last 10 years or so is that the digital sort of transformation has become like an enabler and a fantastic tool to accelerate this transformation of governments. And in the recent past, that has been especially accelerated by the pandemic. Data has become the sort of not only the oil of the new economy, but the oil of the transformations of government. So there's a lot of hope and a lot of potential for new technologies and data to disrupt the way we were thinking about government, the way we are doing government, the way we are transforming government. So where I'm coming from in this space is really about, how we can leverage digital innovations and data insights to deliver better governance, both in the way governments operating in terms of being more agile, being more transparent, also being more accountable and more responsive, and also the way governments are relating to citizens. And I think that's the important thing from the bank we're emphasizing. This is not only about technology and putting technology to analog problems and to basically transform bureaucracies into e-bureaucracies. It's really an opportunity to rethink how bureaucracies relate to citizens and how citizens need to be at the center of the transformation of government. So at the CAF, we've been working in the Digital Innovation in Government Directorate for the last couple of years with a number of colleagues to really see how we can harness this potential to deliver at the end better services and improving lives. And I think that's where we're coming from in this space.
Carlos, I think I was reading a study by CAF. I think by your own figures, you were estimated by 2030, I believe, the Latin American and Caribbean region in particular can close the, if that region close the digitalization gap vis-a-vis richer countries. Let's talk about the OECD, right? Group of governments. The region can have an exponential growth, right? And that could generate I think you were estimating 500,000 jobs per year. What is on our way, Carlos? What are the barriers, what the obstacles that we're facing? Is it technology, lack of? Is it people? Is it money? If you can pinpoint to sort of the obstacles, the issues that you see as preventing this to happen, which ones would those be?
Yeah, no, it's a little bit of all of the above in the sense that, but I would also underscore one thing is that Latin America and the Caribbean is not one region that is very similar and homogeneous. You have big cities that are really at the forefront of the digital transformation. If you take nowadays, for example, Buenos Aires, they are really doing really innovative issues. And there's really opportunities to leapfrog some of these challenges and to move forward. Among the most advanced digital countries around the world, you have Uruguay, you have Mexico. So my point here is that there are different realities in Latin America between countries, but also within countries, and I think that's the key challenge. And I think one of the challenges we face in the region in particular is about the digital divide. And the digital divide is increasingly not between countries, because a lot of countries are catching up in different ways, but most importantly within countries. And in Latin America, you see this digital divide also, and that's really a challenge we face between one world that is like urban cities that are large cities. Sao Paulo nowadays is a hub of innovation, not only for Latin America, but for the world. And then a lot of small municipalities that are really struggling to get this digital transformation forward. First point that we need to take into account is really that we need to think local when we talk about digital transformation. There are many realities, there are many differences. The second issue I think that many countries face, but Latin America in particular, are threefold. There's still a challenge about digital connectivity and the last, especially connectivity of good quality, of that is affordable and that is used for efficient and productive purposes. It's not only the issue of reaching the last mile, but there's an issue about the quality of connectivity and the reach of those connectivities. So you still have a problem around getting the connectivity to everybody so that no one is left behind. In other countries, the issue of connectivity is already resolved. The other second point is about the use of technologies by the public sector in different areas. And we see that the pandemic has accelerated, for example, the appropriation of new technologies in the education sector. But I think what has changed most during the pandemic is that before, even though public services were available online, they were not necessarily used by citizens. And I think that has changed. Now citizens, especially the youth, are not only using digital channels to interact with government or to get public services, but they are expecting those. And they want quality services to be delivered. So there's an issue about how people are really using internet. And just to finalize, I think one of the challenges that the report that you're mentioning is underscoring is the appropriation of new technologies by companies and the private sector, especially in a region where over 95% of companies are small and medium companies. And the uptake of digital innovations and especially data insights by SMEs is still incipient in the region, especially when there's not a lot of regional integration. So there's an issue around the uptake of those technologies by companies.
So I think you're already leading the way to what I had in mind, sort of the second question or the following part of the conversation, which was around building blocks, right? And you rightly say that we need a robust connectivity infrastructure in the first place. We need to factor in, consider local realities, right? And also the differences between countries and within countries. So I think that's very important. You talk about people's skills or the digital talent, let's put it that way. And I believe there are others that I would like your comment on, because I think they are as important as those that we have mentioned. And I see we are seeing increasingly how
Mm,
these issues matter to are top of the agenda of governments, but are also impacting the lives of our communities, of our citizens.
mm,
And this is not in Latin America and the Caribbean, but I think more broadly speaking. I'm talking about cybersecurity issues, for instance. I'm talking about regulatory frameworks, how this can enable the adoption of technologies, and perhaps governance as well. Can you comment on these specific issues? Do you see are they part of your conversations when you're
mm.
advising governments? How important they become in realizing the potential of digital transformation?
Mm. No, absolutely, Christopher. You're absolutely right. You have a number of building blocks, but I think one of the things that has changed and that has accelerated a lot in the last couple of years, even before the pandemic, but especially now, is that governments are really now taking that agenda much more seriously. Barriers to reform are lower than they were before. Budget constraints are huge, but they're not necessarily always questioned. Nowadays, when you are a minister for digital transformation, when you talk about digital identity, the dialogue is completely different than before the pandemic, because especially the delivery of emergency assistance, we've seen the real benefits for people to get the digital transformation right. And having these building blocks is also having a real clear strategy, a vision, and a tone from the top. And a lot of countries in Latin America have really accelerated their, getting the house in order, so that all these building blocks that you mentioned are really put together in a comprehensive strategy with a governance framework behind that is stronger. For example, you look at the case of Peru. Peru, in the last 3 years, despite the challenging political environment in which they have been operating, have really put together the different building blocks. Really comprehensive strategy, a governance framework with responsibilities on the different building blocks, strategy to strengthen human talent, especially in the public sector and for the public sector, a number of cross-cutting tools or enablers that are required, digital payments, for example, digital identity. Let me take the example of digital payments, which was an issue that is very interesting, but that was put at the forefront of a lot of countries' policy during the pandemic, because that was a tool through which countries could transfer benefits and social emergency programs to beneficiaries without those having to queue for it and being exposed to contagion. And so people have seen the benefits of digital payments and digital transfers from governments to beneficiaries of social programs much more concretely than before. And this is very important because, for example, in a region that is very informal, with a lot of informality in the economy, and where there's also a lot of corruption. So these type of solutions are providing sort of governance benefits beyond that. One of the key challenges I think that a lot of countries are also facing, and you mentioned, for example, cybersecurity and these other things, it's also the importance of dealing with legacy systems.
Hmm.
Because digital transformation has not started now. We've been doing digital transformation of governments for the last 20 years or 30 years, especially in public finance and in other areas. And so you have a lot of legacy systems. So a lot of countries are now also struggling to see how you deal with the transition from your old to the new systems you want to operate. So I think going back to your point about what are the building blocks, I think one of the important things that has changed in recent years is these building blocks are now clear for governments, and now governments are taking them together, putting them together in comprehensive strategies, and backed up with governance arrangements that are more fit for purpose, if you will.
Yes, I think that we are seeing it's much
Mm,
more visible, the political will, and that to a large extent, I think it's a very good step that is being reflected in some cases in strategies, in
mm,
policies, right? Are you optimistic about how those policies will be implemented, right? Are
mm.
you optimistic about the promise, or, the political will that governments will continue to have with regards to digital transformation? One thing is to have a strategy, we are to have a very nice document, and then another thing is to put the money to, to follow up through the policy process to see really change. From your standpoint, Carlos, are you optimistic about the future in this regard?
No, I am, because if I weren't, I wouldn't be doing the job I'm doing in terms of trying to improve things and moving forward. So I think that's by nature. But I think also something has really changed. There's no turning back. Governments have realized that those who were unprepared to deal with the crisis been struggling. And in Europe, for example, this decade has been labeled the digital decade. I think there's really a sense, a common sense, that this is not only a fad or a fashion that will last, it's a deeper transformation. And it's not only about technology, it's really an opportunity to change things. We've seen that, for example, around the issue of data and the different narrative and the different debates. But let me go back to your point about, I think that you need to put your money where your mouth is in terms of having a strategy and implementing it. And it's very challenging. And for example, we work with Colombia on the artificial intelligence strategy. It's very nice on paper, but they're also now really working on implementing it. And I think one of the example I was mentioning of Peru is also that, especially when you have little budget constraints and little resources, you need to really be strategic on how you're going to implement. But I think one of the lessons I would like to highlight in this debate in the region is that these are not policies made for a government, in the sense that they are not going to be lasting for a couple of years. These are state policies. And when you look at the experience of countries, I think governments around the region, whether they are left or right, they really understand that this is a transformation that needs to stick over time, that needs to be a long-term investment, a long-term effort that needs to be sequenced. We recently did a very interesting study around the case of Portugal. Portugal is not necessarily the most developed country in Europe, but has been able to leapfrog these digital transformations, and now is one of the most advanced digital countries around the world, not only in Europe, but in part of the digital nations. And I think one of the lessons from countries like Portugal or Uruguay is the reforms that have been undertaking have been long-term reforms, 10 years, 15 years, with the same, not necessarily the same policies, but the same vision, with some initiatives that have been sticking in the long term, and that you're building the transformation progressively on blocks. And I think that has been a really very big lesson, that these policies are not necessarily like a fad from a specific government. They really take transformation policies. And I think the bank, what we think also is that the crisis really has put that very strongly in the mind of governance, especially in a region where you have a lot of shifts from left and right governments in recent years. And I think the other lessons that is also starting to emerge is that before we tended to think about digital transformation having a very expensive toy that we wanted to apply in the public sector. I think now the vision is much more business oriented, in the sense that there's much more evidence now that of the return on the investments of this transformation. This is not only about an expenditure, it's about an investment that brings returns, both for quality of lives of people, but also because of it makes your public spending also more efficient. So the narrative is changing in terms of doing like the private sector is doing, using fancy toys, to really a more professional way of looking at public sector innovation, leveraging digital innovation, but especially data. And I hope we'll have the chance to talk about more about these issues around data, because I find that fascinating, and the narrative has changed completely in the past years.
That's super interesting. I like how you referred to the Portuguese example as sort of reform, right? If you think about policies, policies can be changed, overthrown by the change in government, and that's just a nature of how politics and the policy process work. But to the extent that you are perhaps enacting laws that those changes are deeply rooted in a constitution, for instance, in those elements of the jurisdictional framework, I think that allows these policies to have a longer term horizon. And that's what we need, I believe. And to the extent that we're seeing emerging also, as you noted, the ministries of not only of the digital economy that for some time, are already there, and it has been super important the role that they are playing, but ministries specifically looking at digital transformation or specific technologies, the case of the Emirati minister on artificial intelligence, for instance. I think that speaks to already a institutional framework where you have a responsible agency that with a specific budget, with the specific responsibilities that will see for the long term of this policy. So this is great to see.
Absolutely right. And if I may, I think one of the
Please.
shifts that we start to see is that before, let's say, the digital agenda was really driven by the telecom sector, the telecom ministries, or the ministries of
Exactly.
TICs, or the ministries of telecom, and that has changed, and that has changed. And if you look at the experience of Uruguay or Portugal, that has changed because, for example, in Portugal, digital transformation has been from the start 15 years ago when they started a tool for state modernization. So it was part of the agency of state modernization, and it has combined really like a political, really a strong political leadership, because that was embedded within the presidencies of the Council of Ministers, with a political figure saying this is a cross-cutting sort of
Absolutely.
reform, combined with a specific agency that had the technical muscles to make things happen. And this combination of the political, let's say, mandate and the technical capabilities has been a model that has been quite useful, for example, also replicated in the model chosen in Uruguay, in Latin America, where you had an agency that are very strong, but that is also embedded in the presidency.
Let me move on perhaps with a topic that I find very interesting, and I know that you have been working on and writing about, and that again relates a lot to the issues that we see not only in Latin America but in the global south. And perhaps this is the correlation between digital transformation and trust. Trust plays a crucial role, I think, in these digital transformation processes. Citizens, for instance, should be comfortable and trust how their governments are using their data. A very simple example. I think the specifics of about how digitalization can help fighting corruption. Talk to me about this, Carlos. How we can harness the benefits of digital transformation to advance the efforts against corruption.
You're absolutely right to underscore the importance of trust. And I think also because we are at the critical juncture these years, because a lot of definitions are happening at the international level around defining digital trust. And there's a lot of debate about digital rights, for example. And we've seen that at the Lisbon Declaration of the European Union recently. We saw that in Spain with the Charter of Digital Rights. We see that at the UN level. So there's
Very
an
likely
issue
we'll
that
see that in Chile with the coming constitution, right?
exactly, and a lot of choices we're making now are going to define whether the way governments are handling your data will increase or decrease trust. Because at the same time, you have the Pegasus scandals, you have a lot of issues
Exactly.
that are making people very nervous, especially in an economy that is increasingly digital and where the companies that have most valuation in the market are all companies basically monetizing your data. So you have an issue, and I think the issue of trust in the digital world is, my feeling, has really evolved around data, no? Personal data, public data, private data, and all the changing narrative around that. And we need to find the balance between sort of privacy and security on one hand, but also the ability to leverage those data
Of
to
course.
improve lives and innovation in the economy. And one of the areas we've seen that where you have a lot of hope, sometimes a lot of hype, is the potential of these digital innovations and data analytics, if you will, as a tool for anti-corruption. This is a debate that is maybe more for developing countries and emerging markets, but we've seen during the pandemic that especially emergency procurement has been very vulnerable to corruption in all countries. But I would say that one of the things we've seen is two things. The first thing is, let's say, all the actors managing public finance and controlling the use of public resources have been much more digital and data savvy, using artificial intelligence robots to spot corruption risk in public procurement, for example. We see procurement agencies that are smarter at that. We see audit agencies, Contralorias, much more savvy also at using and cross-cutting different and crossing different types of data. For example, Brazil or Colombia have developed their own artificial intelligence sort of system that can spot irregularities much earlier than before. So all of these institutions are becoming much more savvy at the use of those data. Some of them are also using new technologies such as blockchain to secure, for example, land registries or procurement processes.
Exactly.
But my point, I think one of the interesting things we've seen is that fighting corruption has always been a challenge in Latin America, and successes have been few, and it has been really a challenge. And I think the positive part of me see in digital transformation really a big opportunity, because digital transformation strategies can be even more effective anti-corruption strategies that those strategies that are called anti-corruption, and precisely because they are not called anti-corruption. And we see that in two examples. When you digitalize a service, you cut opportunities for bribery. So if people, for example, when they need to go and get their driving license, they don't have to interact with a public official in a ventanilla. As simple as that, the bribery, this everyday bribery that you need for public services. And remember that Transparency International has said that 30%, 1 in 3 people in Latin America have paid a bribe to get the services that they had the right to. So I think that's fantastic to see the digitalization of services and the simplification of procedures can be a really strong tool for anti-corruption, especially for this petty corruption, this bureaucratic corruption that is affecting the quality of life of everyone. The second thing is that a lot of these tools have been applied to the application of public policies, and we've seen that in the social protection field, in the way governments were transferring social benefits, especially emergency benefits, to citizens. Now you have digital identity, and therefore you know who should be receiving what. Before, the beneficiary registries of public protection programs were really difficult to. There was a lot of issues there. Second, there was a lot of leakages. You know, the $1 that was given, maybe half of it only arrived to the beneficiary. Now with digital payments and transfers, 100% should arrive to the beneficiary. So you have a lot of these innovations that are really being applied, and we've seen that during the pandemic, for example, in Colombia, where they're able to identify who should be receiving what type of benefit and transferring this benefit almost immediately. So these applications of technology in traditional policies are also improving, let's say, not only the transparency, but I would say the integrity and the efficiencies of those policies.
Carlos, as usual, you're enjoying the conversation. It just goes too fast. And this is a topic that has so much to offer. If you allow us, we will be looking for you again to perhaps have a second part of this. You have been already very generous with your time and knowledge. It has been great sharing this first conversation of our DX series that we are starting today with Access, Partnership and StateUp. And yeah, hopefully we can very soon chat again.
Thank you, and for to being part of this DX exercise. This is really a personal pleasure, but also a pleasure on the team that is working at the Development Bank of Latin America, at CAF, working on those issues. I mean, we do this because we're also passionate about the opportunity it provides.
I love to discuss more synergies and opportunities, how we can work together. And thank you again and your team for facilitating this.
Thank you.
Thank you, Carlos.